Welcome to The Access. I'm your host, Hayvi Bouzo. In this episode, we'll be discussing the Iranian regime's breach of the nuclear deal, the U.S. policy towards Iran, and the differences between the American and the European position on the Iranian regime. To talk about this, we are joined by General Jack Keane, retired four-star general, former Vice Chief of Staff of the U.S. Army, and the chairman of the Institute for the Study of War. Thank you so much for joining us here once again, General Jack Keane. It's always a pleasure to have you.
It's wonderful to be here.
I want to start by the Political article that talked about your suggestion and basically you coming out on Fox News suggesting to the president to not attack the Iranian regime militarily, the IRGC forces, after the downing of the American drone that cost $135 million. But the president actually listened to your advice and did not go ahead with the limited airstrikes against the IRGC forces. Instead, there was other measures which were taken by the administration. And some people prefer what actually happened and what the president decided to do rather than the limited airstrikes. I do want to understand a little bit more about your opinion and why did you think and you believe that that was the right approach at that time?
Well, I did have some information from a source in the White House that that strike against the drone was done by a tactical commander authorized by that person, but not authorized by the national leadership of Iran. As a matter of fact, that certain key leaders were very upset that this took place. So given that fact that there was a tactical mistake, I talked on television about a mistake the United States made in the same area in 1988 in July, when we were conducting operations against the Iranians who were disrupting the oil tanker flow through the region. And we had hit a couple of their oil platforms and also some of their Navy station bases because they had also attacked us. And what we did is we fired at what we thought was an Iranian jet aircraft. And it turned out to be, tragically, an Iranian commercial airliner. And we killed 290 people.
And that was in
July of 1988. It was done by a warship, the USS Vincenza, and they saw on the radar screen something they thought was a jet fighter coming towards them. That was a terrible, horrible mistake, and I talked about it on television that there may have been a mistake here as well. It's been reported that the president did listen to that. But I take him at face value in terms of his decision, and what he said drove his decision, which was 150 people estimated to be killed by the United States kinetic strike against the missile batteries versus an American drone that cost, a lot of money. And he didn't think that was a fair comparison, a fair trade-off. So he canceled the strike that he had already ordered. I believe that was the right call, exercising restraint. It put him on a moral high ground. It gave him some leverage with our allies who don't all agree with the United States policy as it pertains to Iran, as you well know, and so do your viewers. So yes, that was the right decision. Now, what a lot of people don't know, and it's been reported in the media, is that we did conduct an offensive cyber attack on the Iranians around the same time that we would have conducted a kinetic strike. And that attack was very successful, and in of itself, it's a deterrent. We're not able to talk about the target, and we're not able to talk about the results of that strike. But it has been reported that it's been successful. And I think we'll see the United States do more of this because the Trump administration has given authorities to the United States military to do more than what they've done in the past. They removed some of the bureaucracy and approval authorities that surrounded this. No offensive strike would ever be taken without the president's permission.
But when we hear about the 150 people who would potentially be killed, we know that in the IRGC force areas, we're talking about IRGC forces that would be potentially killed in an American airstrike. I mean, are those the people that the president was worried about?
I think he just saw that, he certainly knew that this was military people. We're not talking about civilians here at a missile site. And I don't even know if the 150, to be frank with you, are accurate. That information was provided by a lawyer who's in the system here back in the United States. He's probably assessing what is the normal strength that's at that site. We're going to attack that around 3, 4 o'clock in the morning. I think they know an attack is likely coming. I doubt if they're manning their missile systems because they can't defeat a cruise missile. They can defeat airplanes, and we're not coming with airplanes.
Yeah.
We're coming with cruise missiles. I suspect they were in the ground, not at their missile sites. Anyway, that's speculation on my part. But I don't want to read too much into it. That was the number the president was given. He based his decision on that number, and he certainly knew they were military people.
And my other question, and it's always a question that comes to my mind when we talk about having limited airstrikes against regimes, rogue regimes, terrorist regimes like the Iranian regime. And what are basically the results that we would get out of a limited airstrike versus having and conducting these other, cyber attacks, rallying our allies to support a bigger strategy? I mean, in your opinion, is limited airstrikes a successful tool for the United States, or is it not very strategic because it actually only empowers the viewpoint and maybe showing these regimes as a victim of the United States aggression?
Yeah, my perspective is that President Trump is conducting the most successful campaign against Iran in 39 years. He's on a strategic offensive to isolate Iran politically and economically. And that campaign is succeeding actually beyond expectations. The economy's contracted almost 7%. Inflation is somewhere near around 40%. High unemployment, particularly among young people. Food shortages, power outages, growing civil unrest in the country, and notable, something we've never achieved before in previous sanctions, that operational funding of Hezbollah, of Hamas, of the Houthis has not been what it has in the past to direct and fund 2 civil wars in Syria and in Yemen, both producing human catastrophes on a scale we haven't seen in decades. That is being impacted, and that is all good. So if that is working, to go back to your point, why would the United States introduce kinetic military means which falls into the hands of what the Iranians want? What do the Iranians really want? They disrupted the oil tanker flow because they want to create a crisis. They want pressure on the United States from all of those countries who are dependent on that oil. India, China, Europe, etc. All those countries pressure the United States because of the crisis that the Iranians are creating, pressure the United States to back off on the sanctions. So I think a kinetic strike against that drone would fall right into their hands, because then they would have to do what? Then they would have to respond to that strike. And we start walking up the ladder of escalation. And that is something you got to be thinking about. When you pull the trigger one time, you got to recognize your opponent's going to do something about that. And where are you going to be the 4th or 5th time? Do you want to go there? Now, if U.S. forces are attacked in Iraq or at one of our bases there and Americans are killed, the president will respond militarily as a result of that. There will be no choice. He will have to respond, just as Ronald Reagan responded in the late 1980s, took down some oil platforms and some Navy staging bases of the IRGC. But I come back to it. The strategic strategy is working. Iran is on their heels in a way that they've never been, and they're lashing out desperately. Sabotaging those tankers is a desperate move on their part, particularly given the surveillance we have today. They got caught at it, and it backfired. Now they're trying to enrich uranium to blow up the nuclear deal so that the Europeans will provide some economic relief. Unlikely the Europeans will cooperate with this.
Well, they're trying to say that there is now basically a new protocol, a new way for them to help the Iranian regime economically so they can keep them in the deal. But how realistic is that? I mean, you just said that this is not something that they're going to be able to deliver. Are they just buying time, the European countries?
I think the Iranians are pulling out all the options that they have in their means to try to reduce the impact of these sanctions, threatening and using blackmail to blow up the nuclear deal with the Europeans is another option. And they're going to gradually increase the amount of uranium enrichment every 60 days, putting more pressure on the Europeans. I don't believe that will work. And then the Iranians will come back to what? They may come back to military provocation again. And then I don't think the Iranians are ready to talk right now, even though there's some thought that they maybe are.
Yeah, they're saying that they are. They want to talk about the ballistic missiles.
You see what the conditions are for talking. In other words, they're not going to come to the table unless you're willing to back off on sanctions. That's the same deal that Obama fell for. When they came to the table to discuss the nuclear deal, the condition for the United States coming to the table was to back up on the sanctions, and we did that. That was a huge mistake. This administration will not make that mistake. I don't think the Iranians will come to the negotiating table until, Javi, they've run out of options. They've exhausted all of their options. That's the last thing that they want to do, is actually talk to Donald Trump about nuclear weapons, their behavior in the Middle East. Why? Because to get a deal with President Trump, they're going to have to give up a lot. And they know that's going to be on the table, and they don't want to go there. They're not dealing with Secretary John Kerry. They're not dealing with President Obama here, who are preoccupied with having a nuclear deal regardless of what the cost was. This administration has learned from that, painfully so. We've all witnessed it. They're not going to go down that road.
Now we have the disappearance of another oil tanker in the Hormuz, and we're still looking at the responses that we're going to be seeing. We know that Britain is going to be sending another military ship to the Hormuz as a response to the Iranians. But what about the United States? I mean, Iran is now acting as it is, as a rogue state, but it's also like a pirate, basically, in the Hormuz. And they continue to be screaming out because they're really upset about all of the sanctions and the things that you've mentioned that were really actually working effectively against them. Yeah,
I mean, these are acts of desperation, the way I look at it. Secretary Pompeo has traveled to the Middle East, and he's talked to all of our allies, and he is stitching together a coalition to protect international tanker traffic in the Persian Gulf, the Straits of Hormuz, and the Gulf of Oman. The United States will participate in that. We'll provide some overhead surveillance. And in this day and age, you don't have to have a bunch of warships out there escorting tankers through the Gulf. After all, what the Iranians don't want is to be identified as the culprits. We caught them at it once already. We have indisputable evidence that they were involved in all six. We got it. And we've showed that to our allies. So we have significant surveillance. And all you need, to be frank about it, is guys on tankers with iPhones to catch the Iranians at this. It's fairly simple. When you think about it. You can have small boats around the big tankers, and you don't have to have guns, you just have to have a camera. Take a picture of these guys doing this. And we got them.
And they're caught, yes.
And they're caught. And we put it right out there for the whole world to see. Then they have no deniability at that point. So that's being put together. And it doesn't have to be a repeat of the late 1980s, where we had all of these warships taking the tankers through. Some of that will be present. U.S. warships, other allied warships. The Sunni Arabs will provide some of that. But
they're talking about that, yes.
Already done, already agreed to.
Okay.
And what we will see, and we are seeing now, is as much surveillance as we can possibly provide as protection also.
So that's the strategy, just providing surveillance as much as possible and let them
and also have warships present.
And they're just going to keep, doing it, but there's no response. And this is the hardest, I think, kind of corner where they could be boxed up in, where they're not getting any feedback or response that they could exploit and try to.
Well, it's self-defeating for the Iranians. When you think about what their strategy is, they want the international community to put pressure on the United States because they're disrupting the flow of oil to those countries. And I think the reverse is happening. In other words, those countries, not all of them agree with the United States pulling out of the nuclear deal, particularly France, United Kingdom, and Germany, to name three, and Russia and China. But as the Iranians act out these provocations and disrupt the tanker flow, it's a fact that half of the world's economy depends on a stable flow, uninterrupted, of oil through the Middle East. While the United States no longer is dependent on Middle East oil, we are dependent on a stable world economy. That's in U.S. national interest, stable world economy. And if you significantly disrupt the oil flow in the Middle East, that economy starts to spin out of control. We don't want that, nor do the other countries want that, even though they may not be as dependent on Middle East oil as other countries are. So I think as Iran continues to move down this path, it will actually work against them and not for them.
And so, in your opinion, military options should not be on the table for Iran? I mean, when we talk about Iran and the biggest problem, the elephant in the room, as the nuclear weapon, what is the ultimate solution for this? Because, we know that this administration basically does not want to allow Iran to have a nuclear weapon. Israel does not want to allow Iran to have a nuclear weapon. But what is the best way to go about this? Especially that now we're talking about they're re-enriching uranium, acting out on whatever they can do to provoke and get people to negotiate with them and give them their money that they want to have, not theirs, but the money that they need to keep funding their revolution throughout the region.
Yeah, well, I think the ultimate solution, Senator Graham, Lindsey Graham from South Carolina, prominent U.S. senator, and I wrote an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal this week, as a matter of fact, published on Monday, on this issue that you're dealing with. And what we said, the Iranians continually say that they are only interested in nuclear power for energy purposes. That is their stated goal. We believe they've been lying about that ever since they mentioned it, that their real intent is to have a nuclear weapon which will preserve their regime indefinitely. But let's put on the table, begin negotiations with them. Okay, you want nuclear power for energy purposes. We would agree for you to do that. However, you cannot have any enrichment capability, no reprocessing capability, no fabrication capability. The fuel for that nuclear energy power will come from the outside. And make the same deal with the Sunni Arabs. No fuel enriched in your own country. You have to buy it on the market and have the UN inspectors go in anytime, any place, and make certain that there is no other fuel in excess of what is needed for nuclear energy in all of those countries. Because the nightmare scenario is a nuclear arms race in the most dangerous neighborhood in the world, which is the Middle East. That is a nightmare scenario. The Iranians pursuing nuclear weapons and the Sunni Arabs pursuing nuclear weapons with all the flashpoints that already exist. And the nightmare scenario is there would be the first ever nuclear exchange in the history of mankind. That is awful to contemplate.
Yes.
So let's put it on the table. Let's get the cards played, and let's see where the Iranians are. Now, do we believe the Iranians will take that deal? No. Why? Because they really want a weapon.
Yes.
Well, that will announce to the world what their real intent is. Will the United States ever permit the Iranians to have a nuclear weapon? Certainly not under this president. I cannot see under any president permitting something like that to happen. And the Israelis are certainly not going to let that happen. And if they're in pursuit of a nuclear weapon, the Sunni Arabs will be doing the same thing. And that is really unfortunate. So that's the collision course that's in front of us, and we're trying to avoid that collision.
As you just mentioned, this president is not going to allow that. This administration is not going to allow that. But there's a strategy by the Iranian regime that was suggested, according to some reports, by the former Secretary of State, John Kerry, who suggested to Zarif, hold off, wait until the next American elections, and try to just survive until then. And then under a new president, as Democrat, is going to be much more lenient towards you and will probably be able to renegotiate another deal with you. What do you think of this suggested strategy by obviously our former Secretary of State. I'm not even sure if that's true, but it was reported by many accounts. And I just wanted to hear your opinion on this strategy to hold
Well,
off.
two things. I think it is true, at least I've been told as much by administration officials, that former Secretary Kerry met with his counterpart, Zarif, Foreign Minister of Iran, many times, and advocated that position, which, by the way, is in violation of U.S. law. You cannot, as an American citizen, negotiate with a foreign power against the stated policy of your government, the United States. November 2020 is what we're talking about, is when the U.S. election is. That's a long way from now. If the Iranians want to drag this out until that time, I think the situation and the noose is tightening around their neck, and I don't believe that time is on their side. I think time is on the United States' side here because of the crippling sanctions. I doubt they can wait until a new president is elected. And secondly, they're sort of rolling the dice here. Most people in this country in 2016, at least the political experts, did not predict the outcome that took place in terms of President Trump getting elected. For the life of me, I don't think anybody knows for sure who would be elected in 2020. I think people know who they're going to vote for.
Yes.
But or what party they would vote for. Let's put it that way.
Yes.
The Democrats have to figure out who their candidate is. But that doesn't mean who is going to be elected. And I don't think anybody really knows. And certainly the Iranians don't have any more insight into this than Americans do. So that's a strategy, I think, that's fraught with huge potential failure. I think we'll see the Iranians, despite the fact that the Supreme Leader has told his people, I'm never going to negotiate with Donald Trump. That can change very quickly as economic collapse starts to cast a shadow over that regime. As civil unrest continues to grow in the country, that is a pressure point that they're not used to having on a regular basis.
Do you believe that the Iranian regime will not survive until November 2020?
No, I think they'll survive.
They will survive.
Yes, they'll survive.
But then why do you say that the strategy is not going to be
Well, because he
helpful for them?
can't afford to have economic collapse. He would come to the table
before that happens.
Right. At the end of the day, remember what most authoritarian regimes and what's driving them is their desire to stay in power at all costs, at the cost of their people, repressive regimes. We've seen repressive regimes throughout our lifetime. They all have the same characteristic. They want to stay in power, and they'll do anything to stay in power, to include kill their own people, kill other people's people, conduct war if necessary. Staying in power is the ultimate goal that the regime has. And if staying in power means sitting down to talk to Donald Trump because the alternative is unacceptable, they'll do that.
What do you think, this administration, how much is this administration willing to sit down and talk eventually with the Iranians? We've heard before that the only person that the President Trump would want to talk to is Khamenei, because he is the ultimate decision maker. But, how willing do you think this administration is to sit down actually with the
Iranians? I know for a
Iranians?
fact that they're willing to talk today.
Today?
Today.
With who? With Rouhani and Zarif?
I think the negotiations would start at a lower level. Foreign minister to foreign minister, our Secretary of State to Foreign Minister Zarif. That would be a start. I don't think the Supreme Leader wants to get in a room with Donald Trump. The Supreme Leader's stooge is Rouhani. I don't know. They'd have to make up their mind, whether the president's willing to talk to somebody other than the Supreme Leader, who's his counterpart. Rouhani's not his counterpart. His counterpart is the head of state. But I do know for a fact that what the president has said publicly is the truth. He's willing to talk today to move this into a better place than what it is.
What would that the administration would be asking the Iranians today? If they sit down today, what is the president's request from the Iranian? What type of situation are we talking about, knowing this regime? They know this regime.
No nuclear weapons, and I suggested a solution for that. No ballistic missiles.
Yes, that was included. That is another
And
bar that was
anytime,
raised.
anywhere inspections to make certain that this is not taking place. These are all ingredients that were never in the original nuclear deal. No sunset clauses whatsoever. This is indefinite. And change your behavior in the region in terms of sponsoring your proxies, funding your proxies to conduct wars and to try to control and dominate the Middle East. All of that is on the table. None of that was on the table when the previous administration was talking. When they came to the table, Secretary Kerry had told his counterpart, Zarif, that one of the conditions that they wanted to establish was your behavior in the region, and we needed to change that behavior. And Zarif said this to him: if that's a condition, we're not talking. And what did Secretary Kerry do? He took that condition off the table. What we should have done is told Zarif, we'll see you next year. And that condition will still be on the table, and the year after that, and the year after that. We're not talking unless that condition is on the table.
What happened with Zarif? There were sanctions that were proposed against him, taken off. Now he's in New York, but restricted to staying within the United Nations. I mean, why did we see this back and forth within the administration? Is there disagreements on sanctioning these high-level officials within the Iranian regime? There were some suggestions that Zarif would be sanctioned. Then that was retreated. The sanctions were stopped, and he was allowed to come.
Well, the U.S. position is to continue to escalate sanctions as opposed to escalate militarily. So after the last incident involving the sabotage of the tankers and the shooting down of an American drone, the president made a decision to increase the pressure on the regime by imposing more sanctions, and also to impose sanctions on the supreme leader.
Yes.
Now, that's somewhat symbolic, I think, in terms of actually imposing an economic sanction. A lot of that money he has placed in places where the United States cannot interfere with it. But nonetheless, I think it's important to recognize that he's making all the key decisions to perpetuate this rogue regime and what it's doing to his own people in Iran and what it's doing to other people and the catastrophes in Syria and Yemen that they created.
What do you make of the reports that there are some disagreements within the administration, that John Bolton is much more hawkish on the Iranian issue than others? Do you agree with this assessment, or is everybody on the same page in terms of the Iranian regime today? Mike Pompeo, John Bolton, and President Trump.
In all the administrations that I'm familiar with, that I served when I was on active duty for almost 40 years and that I've been involved with since, there's always this. These are complex, no easy solutions to these problems. And every president wants differing viewpoints. I mean, this president, like other presidents, talks to people that are not in his administration. I happen to be one of them, but I don't want to overplay my influence. I don't talk to the president on a scale anywhere near his advisors do. But he welcomes different thoughts of view, and as I think all presidents would. And the fact that there's disagreements at times over these very difficult and challenging issues, I think that's good government. I mean, what is not good for a president is for his advisors to understand where he's coming from, anticipate his view on this issue, and give an answer to him based on where his viewpoint is, as opposed to giving him honest advice based on what you think is best for the country and best for our allies. That's what he needs to get. It's overdone, I think, the differences that John Bolton may have with others in the administration or with the president. Now, are there differences? Yes. Look at John Bolton, Secretary Pompeo, the director of the CIA, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, the Secretary of Defense, all disagreed with pulling out of Syria, to include myself and Lindsey Graham. And all of us in one way or another, told that to the president, face to face.
Yes.
All right? And he changed his position as a result of it. But I think that's good government.
Yes.
You know? So the media has a tendency to take Bolton's positions that he had before he joined the administration, which are to the right of the president's, I'm not disputing that, and believe that that's where he is on every issue. I doubt that. But I think any disagreement inside the advisors to the president is good for the president to get contrarian views. And this president welcomes contrarian views, despite his strong persona and his everyday, tweeting and communication about everything under the sun. He does welcome advice, particularly on complicated subjects that he doesn't have as much knowledge of. I mean, he's very comfortable when he's dealing with trade issues, economic issues. He's not when he's dealing with the ins and outs of why the problem with Iran, what's the history there. Syria, very complex problem, what's the history there. So people have to give him information that he may not have. Now, after 2 years, though, he's quick. And he has a knowledge base right now that is significantly different than when he started.
Yeah. What do you think of the president's pick to Mark Esper to be the new Secretary of Defense?
Well, he picked somebody that he wanted, and I think that's pretty important. He gets all sorts of advice on who should have what position, but he happened to know Esper because he's been the Secretary of the Army for 2 years. And while he didn't see him on the frequency, he would see the Secretary of Defense or the Chairman of Joint Chiefs.
James Mattis at that time.
Yeah, James Mattis. He does see him, so he had a working knowledge of him. And I think they wanted somebody that also would not take a long time to get confirmed, because we've been without a Secretary of Defense ever since General Jim Mattis left that position. And we've had a person in the acting position. So those two things were at play. One, he knew him personally himself, and two, given the fact he's already Secretary of the Army, he doesn't have to go through the long background checks and everything that somebody else who's not in government would have to do. He's passed all of that.
Yes.
And how to deal with your own personal finances, etc.
Yes.
All of that's done. So those are the two reasons I think he's selected. And the most important thing is the president has confidence in him. So good thing, I think.
Do you think is a good thing? Now we're seeing also an increase, at least geographically, in the Israeli airstrikes against the Iranian IRGC forces and Hezbollah forces in Syria. We saw that recently, and then we did not see the S-300 Russian missiles respond and whatsoever, even though there was all these, threats before, and there was by Russia that they are not going to let or allow Israel to do so. But we have seen complete silence from Russia, and obviously there is the frequent meetings between the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and Vladimir Putin. Where do you think this relationship is going? And obviously the Israeli position on the Iranian presence in Syria continues to be very strict and
yeah, I mean,
clear.
It's an interesting subject that you're raising. The Israelis are reported to have conducted close to 200 airstrikes, and most of them in the last couple of years, against Iranians' aggression inside of Syria. So our audience can appreciate Iran looks at Syria as a strategic anchor. They run the war in Syria, not Assad. Their IRGC generals direct that war. They're the ones that, it was Qasem Soleimani that visited Vladimir Putin twice in 2015 to persuade him to militarily intervene in that war. There's been 4 or 5 IRGC generals killed in that war. To give you a sense of the Iranians' commitment here, they clearly want to own that country just like they own Lebanon. And that's what they're about. And they clearly also want to encroach on Israel's sovereignty and security by setting up small missile bases in Syria. So when Israelis see either moving by road or bringing in by air or by sea potential missiles for Hezbollah and for the use of Hamas, or to put into staging bases inside of Syria, they conduct these strikes. Now, you're right. There are sophisticated air defense systems there. And the Russians, from the moment the airplanes are in the air in Israel, believe me, the Russians have them on the radar screen. Watch them fly across the border, watch them go to the target, drop their bombs, and return to where they came from. They watch all of that, and yet they don't fire. Why is that? Well, because Netanyahu, the prime minister of Israel, has worked out a deal with Vladimir Putin. Despite the fact that Russia is aligned with Iran, and they both have common interest in Syria, in propping up the Assad regime, Netanyahu has worked out with Putin a deal to this effect. Look it. The Iranians, your friends, are encroaching on the security of this state, and I'm not going to put up with it. However, I will use minimum military response, not maximum military response, minimum military response to deal with this. I will strike them when I see evidence of the fact that they're doing something that will contribute to a violation of Israel's sovereignty and security. But I'm not going to conduct an all-out attack on Iran, even though I may have justification to do that. I think that's part of the deal that is struck, and also, as a result of that, Netanyahu does not speak out against the Russian military intervention into Syria. The United States has repeatedly. Netanyahu has not. And that's part of the deal. And I think this will continue for the foreseeable future.
Now, I do want to move. Actually, before I move, there is another question about Syria, because a lot of people were saying if the United States wants to respond to Iran, Syria is the best place, because, as you mentioned, Syria is a very strategical place and base for the Iranian regime. It's violating every international law by being there. Obviously, the atrocities that are committed by its forces. Why don't the United States, if it needs or it wants to respond to Iran at one point, respond to Iran in Syria?
Well, I mean, that's a very good point, and I think it's very strategic what you're suggesting. I am of a mind that if the Iranians begin to exhaust all their options, one of their options is to attack U.S. troops in Iraq or U.S. forces at one of our many, many bases throughout the Middle East. If we do that, the natural instinct would be to respond in kind and go attack something inside of Iran, take out one of their bases that maybe contributed to that attack taking place. I would not do that, because that you're walking up the ladder of escalation. You're attacking the sovereignty of Iran. Now, they just attacked us at one of our bases, and that's our sovereignty. But also, that begins to threaten the Iranian people. What I would do is go to Syria, and go to Syria significantly, and hurt Iranians' military capability, which is quite significant inside of Syria. Make them pay a price, because Syria is their strategic anchor. It's the most adventurous thing that they have done since they took over in 1980, is grab that country because of its significance. And it's an oil-producing country at that. That would hurt them quite a bit. And it avoids walking up the ladder of escalation by attacking Iranian soil, Iranian military bases, which would be the natural thing to do. You attack a U.S. base in the Middle East, we're going to attack yours. That's essentially what Reagan was doing in the late 1980s. In this day and age, there's a better choice, and that better choice is Syria. Now, some would say, well, the United States is interfering in the civil war in Syria. No. When we responded twice to Assad's use of chemical weapons since Trump became president, no one believed that we were interfering in the civil war by conducting those limited strikes. This would be of the same. We would conduct strikes not against the Syrian people, against Iranian military capability inside Syria. But it would...
Which is what Israel has been doing.
Yeah, but this would be more significant, and it would impose more cost on the Iranians. That, I think, is the better solution.
This is very interesting. I think suggestion here, you know, knowing how sensitive Syria is to the Iranian regime, but also the Houthis. Now we see an increase of basically declaring themselves the Houthis as an arm to the Iranian regime by targeting, you know, Saudi Arabia and being more involved in this new, you know, rogue activities by the Iranian regime as a response to the sanctions. In your opinion, what is the appropriate American response to the Houthis at this point?
Yeah, well, I don't think the United States needs to get directly involved in that war in Yemen. I think one of the things we could have done is organize a humanitarian effort to try to provide some relief there and put pressure on the Sunni Arabs to get the country opened up so we can get food in there, medical supplies, and the rest of it. I think that's something we could do. But this problem that we have with the Houthis, Secretary Pompeo, in working this alliance to protect the tanker traffic, has included in that protection not just the Persian Gulf, the Straits of Hormuz, and the Gulf of Oman, but Bab al-Mandab, which is the entry to the Suez Canal. When you look on a map and you see Western Yemen, right at the end of Western Yemen is Bab al-Mandab,
yes,
which they have interfered with, the Houthis have done in the past. They have attacked ships there. And what they could easily do is run their boats out, just like we see the IRGC do in the Straits of Hormuz. They can drop mines in there. They can fire missiles at these boats. So the protection and surveillance that the United States is organizing with our allies will include that to prevent the Houthis from taking this kind of action. Because, of course, the Iranians will use the Houthis, just as they'll use Hezbollah, just Hamas, the IRGC. They'll do anything that they can to use those means to create a greater crisis, put pressure on the United States to back off.
I mean, there's a lot to talk about. There's the Iraqi question, because Iraq is a very complicated place because of the very intense Iranian influence, but at the same time, the American influence at the same time, which is a very rare occasion where the United States and Iran are present in the same country together in a very interconnected places. In your opinion, I mean, this is another country where there is tension. Iran is threatening the American presence. The United States is asking Iraq to increase oil production to compensate for the Iranian lack of oil production. What is, you know, in your opinion, how much can Iraq hold off onto all of that in a very kind of sensitive political environment in Iraq as well?
Yeah, the political challenge in Iraq is obviously greater than the military challenge. ISIS is resurging to a certain degree
in Iraq today,
particularly in northeast Iraq. But the political challenges are truly significant. You mentioned one of them deals with the Iranian political influence in Iraq, which has always been there. And it's a challenge for the Iraqis. I think it's a challenge for the United States. The population mobilization forces that are Shia militia inside of Iraq are numbered somewhere around 130,000. They're comparable to the Iraqi military, and about 60% of that are influenced by the Iranians directly. So there's a significant Iranian proxy participation inside of Iraq and presence that's there.
And they're stronger than the army, I mean, according to some sources.
Yes,
they're very strong.
Very strong. And that has influence on the political machinery inside of Iraq. That's why it's very important for the United States to stay in Iraq. We have a small military presence there, 5,200 troops. But even though that's a small presence, it gives us political leverage with the Iraqis. Plus, they know that we did come to their assistance when ISIS trampled over their country. And the United States was quite decisive in helping them. We should have done it sooner. Obama took too long to react. He should have reacted immediately. You know, Maliki wanted help in January with the first invasion, and we didn't do anything for him until August. And that was shameful on the United States' part. But the Iranian, they're all in Iraq, and they're using everything they can to minimize the United States' influence, maximize themselves. They're not able to provide the slush money that they used to provide to the Iraqis now, that they have always done in the past, because of the problems they have financially themselves. So it's going to be a problem. And even if the United States troops are attacked in Iraq, the knee-jerk response would be to go right back and attack those people that attacked us right there. I wouldn't do that. I'd go to Syria.
You go to Syria.
I would go to Syria and hammer them very hard in Syria, and not walk up the ladder of escalation in Iraq, because 5,200 against 60, 80,000 Iranian-backed Shia militia, not a good comparison.
Yes.
Even though we have air power. And what would happen next if we're going to start fighting each other? Next thing the president is going to get is a request from the Pentagon: we need to put more troops back into Iraq. And the American people will throw up their hand and say, what, again?
Yes.
We're going to do this again? You know, for the third time?
And the American people do not want to do that.
Well, they would do it if Americans are being killed, and the only way is to put more troops in there. But politically, I think it would be a problem. And there's a much better solution: go hammer the Iranians in Syria and make them pay a real price.
Lastly, Hezbollah. I know we're running out of time. Hezbollah, today we know that the administration has sanctioned 2 parliament members in the Lebanese parliament that are affiliated with Hezbollah. This never happened before. There was criticisms and upsetness from the Lebanese government, which is dominated by Hezbollah today. There's now new ways the administration is suggesting to monitor the support that they're giving to the Lebanese army, where it does not benefit Hezbollah, which is really doubtful, knowing how infiltrated is the Lebanese army by Hezbollah forces and militias and heads, etc. So I just wanted to know your assessment on this development and trying to basically also tighten up on Hezbollah in Lebanon.
Yeah, well, you're absolutely right. The Hezbollah run Lebanon politically, militarily, socially. They run the country, and they're a proxy of the Iranian government. They're stooges for the Iranian government. And this administration is putting everything on the table that deals with Iran. What is Iran really doing, not only in the region but around the world, and taking it on comprehensively in a way that previous administrations actually were ignoring for various reasons, even Republican administrations. No administration has ever truly, directly and comprehensively confronted the Iranian regime since they forcibly took over the country in 1980. Not a Republican or a Democrat until this one. And I'm not an apologist for this, for the president. I don't agree with all the foreign policy of this administration, and I push back on it publicly and privately when I can.
Some elements of the foreign
policy. But I do agree overall with their approach to China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran. And Iran is the most determined foe the United States is dealing with. And I compare it to Russia, China, and North Korea. They are ruthless. They are brutal. They've been at it for 39 years. They are going to be very formidable to deal with. And they're not going to give up easily. It's going to require this kind of pressure, forcible pressure, to change their behavior. And pushing back on them in Syria, pushing back on them in Lebanon, pushing back on them in Yemen, and in the region at writ large is important. And so I applaud the administration for taking on this, and we should do more of it.
I want to thank you so much. It's always great having you. I mean, this conversation continues. I had other questions, but we are out of time. Thank you so much,
No, it's
General
great being
Jack
here.
Keane.
Thank you.
That was it for tonight's episode. Thank you for watching. Good night.